Hi, I'm Emily Knox. Along with being a new assistant professor, I'd also like to mention that I'm a graduate of the school. I received my master's from here in 2003. I always like to say that because I got a wonderful education here, and I like to let people know. Today, I'll be talking about one aspect of my dissertation research, and that's basically how reading practices inform censorship behaviors and practices. I'm particularly interested in understanding how people understand the practice of reading, and I use what might be called the discourse of censorship to focus on these practices. Reading research was an integral part of early research in library and information science. It was an integral component of the graduate education at the Graduate Library School at the University of Chicago. However, it ended in 1932. Wayne Wiegand says that the GLS and librarianship, quote, walked away from an opportunity, unquote. And in some ways, we ceded this research to English and later to cognitive psychology. However, it's been coming back since around the mid-'80s into our field, into library and information science. I'm interested in looking at the investigation into reading as a practice. Outside of library and information science, I particularly use approaches and themes from book history and print culture studies. This is an interdisciplinary field that appears in English and in various other domains. I particularly look at some approaches offered by Robert Darnton. He says that there are different approaches to understanding reading. One of them is that we can examine ideas and assumptions that underline reading in the past. I also use Elizabeth Long's Reading as a Social Practice. This helps us understand that reading is collective and that it relies on both social infrastructure and social framing. In particular, I look at what Stanley Fish calls interpretive strategies. These interpretive strategies give shape to reading, and they give shape to text. And it's important to note that they do not come from the text themselves. They are, as Elizabeth Long says, informed by the collective social infrastructure and social framing. So how do I do this? What I basically do is that I look at reading practices through crisis. That is, when the act of reading becomes problematic. The negative instance, censorship, gives us insight into the practice of reading. So let me tell you a little bit about what I look at. I look at things called book challenges. And this is when someone attempts to remove, restrict, or relocate materials, or when they request either orally or in writing that materials be removed or restricted. I have up here censorship practices. This is a general umbrella term that I use for these different ways of removing access. Self-censorship is included in this, but I really focus on the first two. I get my sources of censorship discourse from three different places. First, I observe public hearings. So if a book challenge moves from the library into the wider sphere, so it goes through management up to the board, there can sometimes be a book hearing. And these are open to the public, and they're usually run in the course of, say, the school board meeting or the library board meeting. I go to those, I record them, and I take field notes, just to get a feel of what the general atmosphere is, and also to get direct quotes from the people who are both supporting or not supporting the particular book challenge. I also do Freedom of Information Act requests to the governing boards to get all the documents possible that talk about book challenges. So these might be the request for reconsideration. These might be minutes from various meetings that were held. Sometimes I get videos, so I get DVDs that I then have to transcribe that show the meetings that go on. Sometimes I get nothing, depending on how their particular attorneys want to respond to my Freedom of Information request. It's different depending on where I send everything out. I also try to interview challengers. This is the most challenging aspect of the work that I do. People who are, say, on the other side of book challenges are often wary of my motivations. They aren't quite sure what I might be looking for, but I am able to interview some of them. And basically, I record these interviews and talk to them about not just the challenge itself, but also how they understand libraries, school libraries, reading, books, and then I go and talk to them more about what their experiences were with the challenge. So from these three sources, I get what I call the discourse of censorship, which gives me some insight into understanding how people understand the practice of reading. So what have I found? One thing that's very difficult is that it's difficult to talk about reading. It's something that becomes a skill, a practice that we do. And I have this picture here so we can kind of think of what happens when we open a book. In some ways, these images jump out at us. But I'm interested in looking at how book challengers, in particular, what their interpretive strategies are. And I found some common strategies that they all employ. So first, they have common sense interpretations of the text. I'm using common sense here in a more philosophical sense that comes from common sense philosophy, wherein the words mean what they say and say what they mean. That is, interpretation is monosemic instead of polysemic. There is only one way to interpret a text, and there's no room for alternative interpretations. There's also some fear of the undisciplined imagination. The idea that children and others may lack critical distance from the text. They don't have the skills to interpret text in ways that are not harmful, and they cannot process them. This is also related to the idea of imaginative visualization and mimesis. This flows from the previous practice, and this talks about how children and others will do whatever they read. So it's a mimetic imagination. If I read something, I will want to carry it out in real life. Finally, I found that there's a lot of concern with long and short-term effects of reading. So this is essentially a slippery slope or causal argument. Books lead to both, say, sexual arousal, which is short-term, and to bad moral character, which is a long-term effect. These strategies were present in almost all of the discourse that I found from the challengers that I read. You can see how, in some ways, they all work together, they inform each other, but I think they give us a real insight into how people talk about reading, understand the practice of reading. So that's all I have for today.